Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So as I said earlier this morning, as we come towards the end of this year, I thought it'd be useful for us to take some time and get back to some of the most foundational things about our spiritual walk and about our sort of identity as a church. What is it that we are really all about, and what is it that we are supposed to be working on in our lives? And so I've chosen to use Oak Arbor's tagline as sort of a guide here that talks about having healthy relationships with the Lord, His Word, and each other. And I love these three concepts together because I really think that they encapsulate everything about what religion is all about. It's about building a relationship with the Lord. It's about learning honestly from His Word. And it's about putting everything that we've learned into action in our interactions with other people. And so this morning we're going to focus on the first part of this, which is a healthy relationship with the Lord. What does it really mean to have a healthy relationship with the Lord, and what does that take? And so to look at this, I want to start by going to the Word and picking up in the same story that we read to the children this morning. That this, at the very end of the Gospel of John, Jesus appears on the shore while the disciples are trying to fish, and they're out all night struggling. And He calls out to them and says, try fishing on the right side of the boat. And they realize that they are catching so many fish, they can't even pull the net onto the boat. And so, like I told the children, Peter then realizes this is the Lord standing on the shore. And he gets so excited that he throws his coat on and jumps into the water and swims to the shore. And everyone else follows behind him. And there, Jesus has a meal waiting for them of fish and bread. But what I want us to focus on this morning is a conversation that happens after this meal between Jesus and Peter. And it's kind of an interesting interaction that we'll see, but it tells us a lot about what it means to have a healthy relationship with the Lord. So let's pick this reading up. This is from the Gospel of John, chapter 21. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my sheep." And he said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." So this is kind of an interesting interaction, right? They're sitting there, and Jesus asks Peter a simple question. He says, "Do you love me?" And he responds, "Of course, you know that I love you." And then he says, "Feed my lambs." But then Jesus asks the same question again. "Do you love me?" And again he says, "Lord, you know that I love you." And then he says, "Tend my sheep." But then a third time he asks him the same question, "Do you love me?" And then he starts to get kind of upset, and he says, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And then he says, "Feed my sheep." And so I think when we think about building a healthy relationship with the Lord, a good starting place is asking ourselves, do I love the Lord? And I would hope that every person in this room would say, yeah, I love the Lord. And so if we love the Lord, if our goal is to have a loving relationship with him, then the Lord gives us these 3 commands in this story. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, and then feed my sheep. And all 3 of these seem pretty close together, that if you're just reading it casually, you might even think, well, he just kind of said the same thing 3 times. But there's a lot of power wrapped up into the little differences between these 3 things that Jesus said to Peter. And so to look at what these mean for us and what the message is that the Lord is trying to send to us, I want to turn now to the teachings of the new church and share a passage from the Arcana Celestia that talks about the internal meaning of what Jesus is saying here. This is from Arcana Celestia, number 10,087. Faith without charity does not love the Lord. Nevertheless, it is able to teach about things connected with faith and love and the things that are the Lord's. This was why the Lord said 3 times, "Do you love me?" And then, "Feed my lambs," or "Feed my sheep." For the same reason, he says, "When you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and lead you where you do not wish." Meaning that in its early stages, the church's faith had possessed the good of innocence like a young child. But when it was in decline, which is the final phase of the church, faith would not possess that good any longer, nor the good of charity, at which point evil and falsity would lead it. All this is what is meant by, "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and lead you where you do not wish." That is, you will pass from freedom into bondage. Girding means being acquainted with and seeing truths in light that flows from good. And walking represents leading a life in accord with those truths. And so girding himself and walking where he wished means acting in freedom. And people act in freedom when an affection for truth, springing from good, governs their actions. And they are led by the Lord. But being girded by another and being led where he did not wish means being in bondage. And people are in bondage when evil governs their actions, and so they are led by hell. Lambs, which the Lord mentions first, are those in whom the good of innocence is present. Sheep, which the Lord mentions the 2nd and 3rd times, are those in whom the good of charity and faith springing from this are present. Also, 3 means the whole period from beginning to end. Consequently, since the Lord spoke to Peter regarding the church from its early stages to when it was in decline, he said 3 times, "Do you love me?" Now, there's a lot that we can pull out of this passage. There's a lot sort of packed into this interaction between the Lord and Peter. But what I want us to focus on really is the meaning of these lambs and the sheep that Jesus mentions. It says in that passage that lambs represent people in whom there is the good of innocence. And the sheep represent people in whom there is the good of charity. Now, what do these things mean? What does innocence mean? I think all of us probably have a general understanding of innocence. We use this term. We know what we're talking about when we say, "Oh, someone is innocent." But I think spiritually, what innocence really means is a willingness to be led. It comes alongside humility. Innocence really is a recognition that we don't have all of the answers and that we need something outside of ourselves to help us and to guide us. In the passage, it talked about the good of innocence being like a little child. And anyone who's worked with children will know that there's a lot that children can do by themselves, that they can do independently. But if you watch children as they work, they are constantly looking to an adult to check in and say, "Am I doing what I'm supposed to do? Am I allowed to do this?" Or when they come up with something where they don't know what they're supposed to do, they go to an adult and say, "Can you help me with this?" And so too with all of us, there's a part of all of us that has this innocence where we realize that we don't have all of the answers, that we try to do things ourselves, but there's a part of us that recognizes we need something outside of ourselves to guide us and to help us. And this is where the Lord comes in. And so the first thing that Jesus says to Peter is, feed my lambs. So lambs represent people who have the good of innocence, these people who recognize that we need the Lord's help in our lives. But what does it mean to feed them? Well, in the teachings for the new church, we're told that feeding represents teaching. And so the message that the Lord is giving with this first statement is, when we come in those times in our lives where we realize, I need the Lord's help, I don't have the answers, He's telling us to seek the truth, to learn things, to go to His Word. So that's the first thing He says, feed my lambs. Go seek truth when you realize that you need something to help you and to guide you. And then a second time He asks him, do you love me? And he says, Lord, you know that I love you. And this time He says, tend my sheep. And the Greek word here for tend is actually the same word that means to shepherd. He's saying to shepherd my sheep, lead my sheep. And so we know that from the passage that we read this morning that sheep represent people who have the good of charity. Now, what does charity mean? Charity is a big term in the new church that we throw around a lot, and there's a lot sort of packed into this word charity. But in its simplest terms, I think charity means having a genuine heart that wants to do good to other people, and we show that in our actions. Charity is genuinely loving other people with our actions. It's people who walk the walk, the people who do the things that the Lord tells them to do. And so the Lord is after the second time He asks, do you love me? He says, tend my sheep, or shepherd my sheep. And in the teachings for the new church, we're told that shepherds represent people who teach the truth and lead to the good of life. But it sort of expands on that it's not just people who teach. It's not just someone who's good at explaining stuff to other people. But it really says that shepherds are people who lead by example. It's people who in their own lives go to the Lord, learn His truths, and apply them to life. And that in turn has an effect on the people around them. So the second thing that the Lord is telling us to do is tend my sheep. He's saying lead by example. Live a good heavenly life. And what's powerful about this is that when we do this, when we live a good life and we lead by example, we not only have the ability to influence other people, but we actually really are influencing ourselves in the process. Because when we try something and it works, when we do something that the Lord teaches us and it makes our life better, then we see, oh, this is good, and I want to do more of this. So that's what He's saying with this second part. He says, be a good example by doing what you are told to do by the Lord. And then lastly, we get to the final thing that He says. A third time He asks, do you love me? And after that, He says, feed my sheep. And now we know now that feeding means teaching or seeking truth. And we know that sheep represents people who have the good of charity. What He's saying is when you get to this point that we are living a good life, that we are leading by example, that we are doing the things that we need to do, that will in turn help us gain more wisdom and more insight to be able to go back and see more clearly where we can continue to grow. So in these three commands that Jesus gives to Peter, feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep, feed my sheep, the Lord gives us a cycle of what we go through in our lives where we recognize that we need the Lord's help in our lives. And so we go to His Word and seek His truth and His guidance. And then we apply that truth to our life. And we lead by example by living the kind of life that the Lord tells us we should do. And as we do that, we gain more wisdom and more insight that we can then go back and look at our lives and see more clearly more areas where we need the Lord. And it helps us reaffirm that the Lord is the source of all that is true and all that is good. And He is the person that we go to when we need guidance, and we know that His advice will be sound. And so it sets up this relationship with the Lord, where the Lord is our teacher, where He is our mentor, where He leads us by His example, and where He is our companion, where He is walking with us along this path, constantly leading us and guiding us as we go. Now, the other thing that's powerful about this story, if we take a step back and look at this in the literal sense of where this story comes in the gospel, that Jesus asks Peter 3 times to affirm that he loves him. And does this remind us of another story that happens just shortly before this, where Peter says something about the Lord 3 times? In the Easter story, after Jesus is arrested, in one night, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And so these two experiences kind of stand in contrast to one another. Where on the one hand, Peter, when the Lord was arrested, denies Jesus 3 times. That people say, weren't you with him? Weren't you one of the people who followed him? And 3 times he says, I don't know who you're talking about. But then, when the Lord is with him on the beach, and the Lord is there asking him, do you love me? 3 times he says, of course I love you. You know that I love you. And there's a part of all of us that falls into this same thing that Peter does. That it's easy for us to feel like, yeah, I love the Lord. I want to follow the Lord. I want to do what he asks. When it feels like the Lord is there, when he's looking over our shoulder. But when it feels like the Lord is absent, or when it feels like the Lord's teachings might not help us the way that we want it to right now, we might be more inclined to deny him and say, no, I'm not sure that I know him. You know, I'm not sure any of us would ever use any bad language while we're sitting in these pews here on a Sunday morning. But how many of us have ever said a curse word out there in the world throughout our week? And I doubt any of us would come to church on a Sunday morning and say, you know, I'm going to say some negative things about other people, or I'm going to spread some gossip about other people. We would never do that in here. But how many of us have ever said something negative about someone else out there in the world when we don't feel like we're sitting in church at that time? This is what the Lord is teaching us in this story. This is what it means to have a healthy relationship with the Lord, is to realize that the Lord is always with us, that he wants us to love him, and he wants us to love him completely. And this story shows us that the way that we show that love to him, the way that we genuinely invest our heart in following the Lord, is to feed his lambs, shepherd his sheep, and feed his sheep. Go to the Word with humility, realizing that we need the Lord's guidance in our lives. Have the courage to apply those teachings to our lives and lead by example and do what the Lord asks us to do. And after we do that and we get to experience the fruits of our labors, take the wisdom and the perspective that we now have and turn it right back to the beginning and say, now let me go back to the Word and keep learning and keep growing. Because the more times we go through this cycle, the closer we will grow to the Lord. The more we will understand the Lord. The more we will feel his presence in our lives. And the more we will know with absolute certainty that the Lord is with us every moment of every day, and that he is constantly beckoning us towards him, leading us towards goodness, towards happiness, and towards peace. Amen. Please rise for a blessing and the closing of the word.